You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com. Go on over, find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. Check out the schedule. See what you can listen to all throughout the day. And also, you can find this broadcast as a video simulcast right on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the other Intrepheads in the chat room, have a good time. And tonight, I want to jump right into where we left off yesterday. And I have a shit ton of material, I have to say, on Nimrod and some of the things that we were talking about Nimrod. This all, of course, came out of our Tower of Babel discussions, and that Nimrod is the king that the biblical account says built that tower, and that he had something not too godly of an intent. That he was really, as the great-grandson of Noah, the Noah of the Noah and the Ark story, the great-grandson, he had drifted away from, well, whatever faith that they had. It wasn't Judaism at the time. This was too early for Judaism, but it was that pre-Judaic religion, that worship of Elohim, and that he had drifted away from that, and he was seeking ways, as you see today, to say, wait a minute, maybe this worship isn't what is real and what is true. Maybe there's a different way. And he started leading the people that way. And according to the account, God came down, confounded their languages, scattered them around the known earth of the time, which I don't think would have included across the ocean into the Americas or anything like that. But that this was the known world that exists over in the Middle East, the Mesopotamian region, Africa, so on. And so we kind of left off talking about some of the different legends that had arisen around Nimrod. And you see all these different cultures attribute different historical periods to him, different accomplishments to him. In the recognitions of the Clementines, Nimrod's equated with the legendary Assyrian king Ninus. We were talking about all of that in the Greeks. The historian Ctesias, as the founder, he was the founder of Nineveh. In other versions, the homilies, he's made to be Zoroaster. And think of the Zoroastrians, and you get an idea there. There was all these other writings, Jerome, the Syriac Cave of Treasures. He was equated to Kitab al-Migdal, the Gez conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. It was written in the 5th century A.D., contains a version similar to that of the Cave of Treasures, but the crown maker is called Satan. And so there's all these versions, all these different religious archetypes are brought in. Ephraim the Syrian in the 300s related a contradictory view that Nimrod was righteous, and he opposed the builders of the tower. And similarly, Targum's Pseudo-Jonathan, that book that we mentioned yesterday, mentions a Jewish tradition that Nimrod left Shinar in southern Mesopotamia, and he fled to Assyria in northern Mesopotamia because he refused to take part in the building of the tower, for which God rewarded him in the 4 cities in Assyria to substitute for the ones in Babel. You can go on, and there's so many of these. I want to just make mention of these, and unless you take fast notes and you want to remember this stuff, you'd probably have to go back and re-listen to this show, because I'm just going to hit on these very quickly, just to illustrate the different stories that arose out of Nimrod's story. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer relates the Jewish traditions that Nimrod inherited the garments of Adam and Eve, made from his father, or he inherited them from his father, Cush. And these would be the animal skin clothing that God made Adam and Eve because they were naked, and so he made them clothing. I wonder what those clothes would have looked like. If that's a true story, what kind of clothes would God have given them? Would he have given them, you see in the movies this depicted sometimes, these raggedy animal skins and just threw them over them? Or would God have given them really cool tailored clothes out of leathers and furs and things like that, and that they look awesome? Who knows? But it says that according to Eliezer, that Nimrod inherited those clothes, and those clothes made him invincible. And Nimrod's party then defeated the Japhethites, another one of the sons of Noah, to assume universal rulership. So already, in the years, within 2 to 3 generations of the time of Noah, there were so many people that they were warring with each other already. And so God saved mankind with the flood. Well, destroyed most of them because of the mixed breeding, the Elohim, the Nephilim, the Watchers, all of that. But already, within a couple of generations, they're warring amongst each other. And apparently very prolific. It's hard to go to war with, your second cousin's family over there, 8 people. What kind of spread of humanity was there by this time? So we are talking, probably 300 years at least of time has passed. So I guess you can have exponential spread. A good example of that just pops into my head. Think of the Mutiny on the Bounty. That story of how Fletcher Christian led a mutiny against Captain William Bligh. And they brought the bounty to a small island called Pitcairn's Island out in the middle of the South Pacific. And they grounded the boat and burned it, and there they lived. And the island was discovered many years later again, and they found a lot of the descendants of the mutineers. And even today, you can go to Pitcairn's Island, and it's very remote, but they have they have some towns there, and they have I think there's about 500 people on the island, the last I heard, that are all direct descendants of the mutineers. But it's taken, 250 to 3. Well, when did this all happen? In the early 1700s, the Mutiny on the Bounty. Or was it the late 1700s? I can't remember. But a couple of hundred years have passed. 250 years, and there's maybe 300 to 500 people living there. The governor of the island is none other than Fletcher Christian. So that's a small way to illustrate. That just popped into my head. That's why I don't have all my facts on it in front of me. But how a small number of people can exponentially spread. Now, they had this little island on Pitcairn's Island, so 300 to 500 of them living on the island today that are all direct descendants. Imagine if you had a much broader landmass to spread out in. What would have happened? So this is kind of what you're looking at with the spread, and so they go to war with each other. Now, this is probably, think of Lord of the Rings as well, Not Lord of the Rings, I'm sorry, Lord of the Flies, if you remember that story. A bunch of schoolboys stranded on an island, and they went tribal in not too long a period of time, and they started warring with each other. So, always somebody wanting to be the boss and to rule everybody else. So, it also says in that tradition, Eliezer's writings, that Nimrod had a son named Mardon. Think of Marduk, who was even more wicked than he was. Now, in the histories of the prophets and the kings, in the 9th century, it was a Muslim historian, Al-Tabari. Nimrod has the tower built in Babel. Allah destroys it, and the language of mankind, formerly Syriac, is then confused into 72 different languages. And another Muslim historian of the 13th century, Abu al-Fida, relates the same story, adding that the patriarch Eber, an ancestor of Abraham, was allowed to keep the original tongue, Hebrew in this case, because he would not partake in the building. And so you see by which culture the story rises out of, kind of determines what the original language was. And the 10th century Muslim historian Masudi recounts a legend that made the Nimrod who built the tower to be the son of Mash, the son of Aram, the son of Shem, one of Noah's sons. And according to that story, he reigned for 500 years over the Nabateans. And see, back when life was a little bit longer. Later, Masudi lists Nimrod as the first king of Babylon and states that he dug great canals and reigned for 60 years. And still elsewhere, he mentions another king, Nimrod, the son of Canaan, as the one who introduces astrology and attempted to kill Abraham. Which kind of leads us, and there's a couple of other traditions I'm just going to kind of skip over, that involve the demonic, the Huns, the Magyars, the demon Niriki, figured into the Finnish, Kalevala, as a helper of Lemminkainen. He's associated with Nimrod by some researchers and linguists. The Nimrod fortress, the Qalat Namrud in Arabic at the Golan Heights, actually built during the Crusades by Al-Aziz Uthman, and the younger son of Saladin, and was anachronistically attributed to Nimrod by later inhabitants of the area. But all of that leads us, as that one story was mentioning, to the evil Nimrod versus the righteous Abraham. And I think that this is an interesting story, and I kind of want to get into this, which was where I was rushing us to head tonight. And there's also some things I want to touch on that mention the whole ancient alien concept of Nimrod, that the Tower of Babel was a launch pad for fiery rockets. You start getting into Zecharia Sitchin type of territory there. Now, I'm going to say this about the whole ancient alien, and I still call it a notion. I've written about that stuff in my past, and I was a little deeper into it at one point because I was looking into it, and it was curious, and it made, some of it seemed to make sense, but it only made sense from an imagination point of view. You start, if you will, imagineering history, and you can come up with all kinds of theories. I tend to be a non-ancient alienist. I've really backed away from that theory. Even when I wrote my book on the Nephilim, I was very much entrenched in the ancient alien theory, and you could really say it's notion. And I was looking for answers that way. And some of the stuff, honestly, folks, makes a little sense when you start tying pieces together, connecting dots. But there's no way to prove it, and that's the problem. And then when I started finding some problems with Zecharia Sitchin's scholarship, now, as I've always said, remember I talked to you a couple of weeks ago about that email I got from somebody just a couple of weeks ago who was really pissed off at me because I said I was taking Zecharia Sitchin to task over his use of certain linguistics and his missing of ancient linguistics, missing of ancient lexicons that would define some of the words that he used, which I believe were these awfully big square pegs shoved into little tiny round holes. So I tend to think Zecharia Sitchin was onto something. He wrote 12 books on the topic, but I think he missed the mark. I think that when we attribute ancient alienism to ancient man, we diminish the pure genius of ancient mankind, their ability to think and engineer things. So do I think the Tower of Babel was a launch pad for a rocket of some kind? That's a stretch for me. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's probably improbable. It was probably just a mud, brick, and stone tower, and it was doing exactly what the biblical, historical side of the story says. It was civilization under one ruler, trying to make a mark for himself and trying to draw the people into believing a certain thing and saying, look, we can reach to the heavens, and let's thumb our nose at God If that God really brought the flood 3 generations ago, let's build a tower so we're safe from it. That kind of thing. And by most of the measurements you get from the biblical tower, they say it was about 300 feet tall. And there is a certain point in those old, even today, you try to build a huge tower, a huge building, there's only so high you can go before you reach an instability point. So, anyway, let's move on. Let's get into the evil Nimrod versus the righteous Abraham. Now, I always thought there was a lot of years between Nimrod and Abraham. But there is this confrontation between Nimrod and Abraham that's said to have taken place according to several Jewish and Islamic traditions. Some stories bring them both together in a cataclysmic collision, seen as a symbol of the confrontation between good and evil, and/or as the symbol of monotheism versus polytheism. You got one God, you're worshiping one God, or is there a bunch of gods? On the other hand, there are some Jewish traditions say that only the 2 men met and had a discussion, which is different than, and maybe they disagreed in a conversation, but they met at some point. Now, according to K. Vandertoorn and P.W. Vanderhorst, this tradition is first attested in the writings of the Pseudo-Philo. And the Pseudo-Philo is the name that's commonly used for the unknown, anonymous author of biblical antiquities. And this text is also commonly known today under the Latin title Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum. There, that shows you how well I know my Latin. Brush up your Latin. Start speaking it now. E pluribus unum. This book, the Pseudo-Philo, the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, if you know your Latin. And it's a title that's not found per se in the Latin manuscripts of Pseudo-Philo's biblical stuff, but this is the book that was written. The story's found also in the Talmud, in the rabbinic writings in the Middle Ages. And in some versions, as in Josephus's works, Nimrod is the man who sets his will against God. And in others, he proclaims himself a god, and he's worshipped as such by his subjects. And sometimes with his consort, Semiramis. And by the way, I've got a whole load of stuff on Semiramis, and I think we might take maybe tomorrow, if we get there, talk about her. A very remarkable account of this woman. But this is his consort, Semiramis, and she was worshipped as a goddess at his side. And this is when Nimrod is referred to as Ninus, or Ninus. I think it's Ninus. And a portent in the stars tells Nimrod and his astrologers of the impending birth of Abraham, who would put an end to idolatry. And now look at this. They had the flood, supposedly the flood, where it's down to about 9 people on the ark. This is all that's left. Noah, his wife, their kids, and their kids' spouses. And then, of course, all the animals. And then it's Noah's 3 sons spread out, and they start the different races of mankind. So a big question to ask is, how did a singular race in Noah, nobody knows what his race was, but how did a singular race in Noah bequeath 3 major other races? So it's interesting study. This is where you say it's an etiology. It's a mythological, fabricated storytelling way to describe the origins of something historical. And so, but it's interesting to me that after all that stuff with the flood and God and the rainbow, I will never do this again, let's worship Jehovah, what's the first thing that Noah does afterwards? He builds a vineyard, he plants a vineyard, and he goes out, he gets drunk. I mean, wouldn't you? Look at what you've just been through. Boy, what are you doing? I'm not going to Disneyland. I am getting stoned. I am getting drunk. So he gets drunk and all the story that goes with this. But this is supposed to be the God of the universe that was in contact with man and did these things. Or was it just in Noah's mind? Was it more isolated a story? Was it a more isolated flood, the known world instead of all the world? Was it an embellished fable? And if so, this is why I think it is so easy for humans to, if they have seen all this great, glorious power of God, so easily drift away. It's like the Exodus. They supposedly saw all these 10 plagues brought by God on Egypt. Or were they natural happenstances or occurrences that were used to create? Was Moses an opportunist when he wrote about this? Why did the people within 3 weeks of leaving Egypt want Moses' brother Aaron to build them a golden calf to worship? This is our God, Hathor. That's good questions to ask, by the way. How can you experience the mighty hand of God, parting the waters of the Red Sea, killing the armies of the Egyptian Pharaoh, and a couple of weeks later you need to build a golden calf to worship? So there's the big question about some of these events we read about. But getting back to Nimrod, there's a portent in the stars that tells Nimrod and his astrologers of the impending birth of Abraham, who would put an end to idolatry. There's already idolatry. The third generation out from Noah, worshiping other gods. And so Nimrod orders the killing of all newborn babies. However, Abraham's mother escapes into the fields, gives the birth secretly. This is, by the way, a literary narrative you see repeated many times throughout biblical storytelling. You had Pharaoh killing all male children 2 years and other of the Hebrews because he heard of the deliverer coming. The stories amongst the Israelites. There was Herod the king, who, hearing from the Magi that the King of Israel was born, the Savior, Christ the Lord. And what does Herod do, the king, Herod the Great? Sends out a decree to have all the babies 2 years and younger murdered. So you see this theme repeated in the Bible. Now here it is again, that Nimrod supposedly, now this isn't part of the biblical story, but Nimrod heard of the prophecies of the coming of Abraham, who would be the father of a nation that would worship the one God. And he set out to kill all the babies. Now remember, Nimrod is also supposed to be responsible for creating the altar to the god. Why it's passing my mind. I'm doing this part off the top of my head, folks. Sorry, don't have it in my notes right here. But he built the Molech, and they would take infants and young babies and offer them into the fires to Molech, the god. And this is supposed to be something that Nimrod did. Now, Abraham's mother, as we said, like the other mothers, Moses' mother, Jesus' mother, they all escape from the tyranny of the king. And at a young age, Abraham recognizes God, and he starts worshiping him. Now, remember, it says that God in the Bible story calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and where Abraham is the son of the high priest, a pagan high priest, and probably a pagan priest himself. And this is where Abraham's story starts. Now, believe it or not, we're already at the end of the first segment of this show tonight. We got to go out to break, so sit tight. We'll be right back, and we'll continue with this. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you can go to odysy1.com to hear this show in its audio format, find out all the different locations where you can find archives of this show, and listen to it live, as well as terrestrial stations where it plays. All over at odysy1.com. If you're listening to the show in audio only and you want to come and see the video and join the live chat room that's going on, come on over to my YouTube stream. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You can listen to the audio stream and come over and join the chat room as well. So there you go. There are your options. Mr. Scotty Roberts at youtube.com. Let's pick this up right away because there's so much information where I can already tell by the way the first half went, we aren't going to get anywhere near finishing this material tonight. So we're gonna spread this over probably several more days because this is interesting stuff. And everything, it's like there's the main river we're following, but there's all these little tributaries that we have to look at because they're interesting topics. And they're things that we never associated with some of these stories before or ever knew existed, unless that's what you do. That you're a monk somewhere and you study all this stuff. Every time I look up information and start researching the main topic, I find 10 other topics that sprout off of it. What would you say? It illuminates the topic, but it lets us see that the main story isn't the only thing going. Moving on. So at a very young age, where we left off, Abraham, the father of the Israelite people, the father of the Jews, if you will. Even though being Jewish is a religion, it's also, we kind of say that there's the race of the Jews. Well, being Jewish is a religion. It's a choice. So he was the father of the Semitic peoples, and how God in the Bible called Abram, it was his name, and he changed his name to Abraham, and he took Abram out and had him look at the stars, and he said, count them. And Abraham said, well, that's an impossible task. And God said, so shall be your descendants as the numbers of the stars. And so we know the stories of the beginnings of Abraham. But Abraham recognized God. He left his pagan ways in Ur of the Chaldees, and he traveled with his whole family clan. He loaded them up. He was a rich dude. He had all kinds of flocks. All kinds of family members in his clan, and they left Ur and they went down into the Canaanite region from Ur of the Chaldees, which is up in, I think, Iraq, and you've got the general location. And by the way, it's like even the Garden of Eden is located in what today would be Mesopotamia. If you look at the rivers mentioned in the biblical story of Genesis, and you look at all, even though geography has changed a bit, some of those rivers still have the same name places, even though their courses have shifted. It talks about the Tigris River in there and the Euphrates and so on. It's all up in that region. And then Cain moves into what is now Iraq. And you have everybody moving a little eastward and then down south into the Canaanite region. This is what Abraham did. And so he recognizes God, he starts worshiping him alone. He confronts Nimrod, and he tells Nimrod face to face to cease his idolatry, whereupon Nimrod orders Abram to be burned at the stake. And in some versions, Nimrod has his subjects gather wood for 4 whole years so as to burn Abraham in the biggest bonfire the world had ever seen. Yet when the fire's lit, Abraham walks out unscathed. That's a lot like, if you remember in the story of, what book is this in? It's not in Daniel's. Maybe it is in Daniel's book. We know the story of Daniel in the lion's den with King Nebuchadnezzar and all of that. But go back a little further, and you've got the story of the 3 Israelites who were in Israel was taken away captivity, and the king was going to burn them in the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it says that the king sought diligently to release them. He didn't want them, but he couldn't go back. It was his own law, the law of the Medes and the Persians. And he did not want to kill them, but all of his officials found a way to get rid of these guys, and they had the king kind of by the nuts on this one. And the king tried to have them released, and they threw the 3 kids, young men, into the fire. And it says even the men who threw them in burned to death. The fire was so hot. And finally it says that the king looked in, and he saw a 4th amongst them like unto the Son of God, quote unquote, and that the 3 young men walk out of the fire unscathed. Well, this is one of the traditions also attributed to Abraham, and how Nimrod wanted to burn him to death. In some versions of the story, Nimrod then challenges Abraham to battle. Well, you didn't die in the fire, so now I'm going to fight you. And when Nimrod appears at the head of the enormous armies, Abraham produces an army of gnats, like mosquito, little versions of gnats, which destroys Nimrod's army. Think of the Mummy movies of recent years with Brendan Fraser, that movie, and how things turn to dust and flies and things like that, and scarab beetles that would eat you. So this is an army of gnats that destroys Nimrod's army. And some accounts have a gnat or a mosquito that enter Nimrod's brain through his ear, and they drive him out of his mind, a divine retribution that the Jewish tradition also assigned to the Roman Emperor Titus, the destroyer of the temple in Jerusalem. And in some versions, Nimrod repents. He accepts God. This makes me think of King Nebuchadnezzar, who threw Daniel in the lion's den and tried again, like the 3 children in the fiery furnace, to release Daniel. And he was so happy when Daniel was unscathed by the lion's den. God shut the lions' mouths. But Nebuchadnezzar goes insane for 7 years. It says he crawls on the ground and ate grass, and they put him out to pasture, and they pretty much put guards over him to make sure either they were hiding part of this story, but the king was gone for 7 years. Then finally he comes to his senses, and it says, and he looks up, and he looks up from the grass. His hair is grown out in his beard because he's been in his fingernails, because he's been like an animal for 7 years. And his senses return, and he looks up and he says, now I extol and praise the high King of heaven, God, Jehovah. I praise and extol him. And he is the one who brings rulers to great heights and lays them low. And he is the sovereign among all the nations. This was Nebuchadnezzar's decree after regaining his senses. So Nimrod repents. He accepts God. He offers numerous sacrifices that God rejects, just as with Cain. Well, like he rejected Cain's sacrifices. Other versions have Nimrod give to Abraham as a conciliatory gift the giant slave Eliezer, whom some accounts describe as Nimrod's own son. And the Bible also mentions Eliezer as Abraham's major domo, though not making any connection between him and Nimrod. So, still other versions have Nimrod persisting in his rebellion against God, or resuming it, keeping it going. Indeed, Abraham's crucial act of leaving Mesopotamia with all his riches, his wealth, his flocks, his family, having been called by God out of Ur of the Chaldees and settling in Canaan, is sometimes interpreted as an escape from Nimrod's revenge. And so accounts considered canonical scripture, meaning truly breathed of God, place the building of the tower many generations before Abraham's birth, as in the Bible, also in the book of Jubilees. However, in others, it's a later rebellion after Nimrod failed in his confrontation with Abraham. In still other versions, Nimrod doesn't give up after the tower falls and fails, but he goes on to try storming heaven in person in a chariot driven by birds. Now, that I would probably say is not something that I would think would be a true story or a true account. Unless you want to start, this is where you start taking like the ancient alien theories and you go, oh, you know what? Those birds, that could have meant fiery rockets. If I use Zecharia Sitchin's linguistics, that might be what I come up with. But is it a possibility? I mean, we know that fiction is stranger. Sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. But if you want to attribute all this magical stuff, this mystical stuff, this extraterrestrial stuff, could Nimrod have mounted an army and flown into the heavens to confront God, or God, quote unquote, the extraterrestrial in charge? Hard to say. We weren't there. As John Ward used to tell me, brother, we weren't there, we don't know. So all we have to go on is history and these writings. But these are some of the versions of this event. And so Nimrod tries to storm heaven in a chariot driven by birds. That would make a great illustration, wouldn't it? It'd make a great picture book for kids, I think. I have all these ideas that come to me to doing picture books for kids, and I get stuck in the fact that I have too much work to do any of them. Maybe someday I'll get to those. So the story attributes to Abraham elements from the story of Moses' birth. The cruel Pharaoh killing the innocent babies with the midwives ordered to kill them. And from the careers of, I just brought this up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who emerged unscathed from the fiery furnace. Nimrod is thus given the attributes of two archetypical cruel and persecuting kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh. And some Jewish traditions also identified him with Cyrus, whose birth, according to Herodotus, was accompanied by portents, which made his grandfather try to kill him. And so a confrontation is also found in the Quran between a king, not mentioned by name, and the prophet Ibrahim, the Arabic for Abraham. Some Muslim commentators assign Nimrod as the king. In the Quranic narrative, Ibrahim has a discussion with the king. The former argues that Allah, God, is the one who gives life and causes death, whereas the unnamed king replies that he gives life and causes death. Ibrahim refutes him by stating that Allah brings the sun up from the east, and so he asks the king to bring it from the west. The king is then perplexed and angered, and the commentaries on this surah offer a wide variety of embellishments of this narrative, one of which is by Ian Cather, a 14th century scholar, adding that Nimrod showed his rule over life and death by killing a prisoner and freeing another. And that's how he did this. And if you want to know, if you want to write it down, it's Tafsir Surah 258. So there you go. So whether or not conceived as having ultimately repented, Nimrod remained in Jewish and Islamic tradition as an emblematic, I can't even say the own word I've written down, emblematic, boom, and they all died. An emblematic evil person, an archetype of the idolater and the tyrannical king. In rabbinical writings, all the way up to our present day, Nimrod is almost invariably referred to as Nimrod the Evil. And that's in the Hebrew. It's come out that way. And so Nimrod is mentioned by name in several places in the Baha'i scriptures, including the Kitab-i-Iqan, I think if I pronounced that right, and the primary theological work of Baha'i religion. And there it's said that Nimrod dreamed a dream, which his soothsayers interpreted as signifying the birth of a new star in heaven. A herald is then said to have appeared in the land, announcing the coming of Abraham. And this was in the Kitab-i-Iqan, the Baha'i Reference Library. You can find that if you want to look for it. And Nimrod is also mentioned in one of the earliest writings of the Bab, the B-A-B, The Bab, born Syed Ali Muhammad Shirazi, was one of the founders of Babism and one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith. And he was the herald of the Baha'i faith. And citing examples of God's power, he asks, has he not in past days caused Abraham, in spite of his seeming helplessness, to triumph over the forces of Nimrod? And that's found, that's Effendi Shoghi, and or Shoghi Effendi, if you want to put it that way, the Dawn Breakers in the Baha'i Library. And so the story of Abraham's confrontation with Nimrod didn't remain within the confines of learned writings and religious treatises, but also it was conspicuously influenced, it has conspicuously influenced modern culture, popular culture. A notable example of this, now you might not think of this as pop culture, but the Quadro El Rey Nimrod, in English, When King Nimrod. One of the most well-known folk songs in Ladino. That's the Jewish Spanish language. Pop culture, can I say, of its day. By the way, this is a book that is a Sephardic folk song. It's not a book, a song. It's a Sephardic, shepherds sang it, folk song. It's sung in Judeo-Spanish language. And it tells the story of the birth of Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, and monotheism and all of that. So, but it begins with these words. When King Nimrod went out to the fields, looked at the heavens and at the stars, he saw a holy light in the Jewish quarter, a sign that Abraham, our father, was about to be born. And the song gives this poetic account of the persecutions perpetrated by the cruel Nimrod and the miraculous birth and deeds of the Savior, Abraham, who brought us back into monotheism. And the full and original text appear in the Ladino. You can go find, there's this Ladino article. Let me see if I can find it right now. This might be interesting. I've got a link here. And I'm going to see if I can pull this up, because this might be interesting for us to read. And we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left here. So let's see if we can squeeze this in. Let's see. It's in here somewhere. Let's see if we can find it. Maybe not. Maybe not. I think it took me to a totally different place. Let's see if I look for this. Let's see. Let's hang on with me a second, folks. I'm going to dig around a little bit. Let me root around for a second as I talk about this. The story of Abraham. I want to look at this one and see if this brings us to the spot that I need to be to find this poem. It might be interesting to read through this. And I didn't think of this ahead of time, but I'm looking at this now. And no, that's a link to buy a book where you can look into it a little bit more. There is also one more link here. Let's see if I've got it. The story of Abraham. Let's see what this one says. And we'll see if we can find that poem. And if not, we'll just move on. Let's see. Hold on. I got something here. Abraham and migration. This is from the Religion of Islam site, islamreligion.com. Their story of Ibrahim and his migration to Canaan. It says he had a dispute with a king. Now, this is according to the Islamic religion site. Modern archaeological discoveries suggest that the high priestess was the emperor's daughter, and naturally she would have made a point to make an example of the men who defiled her temple. So soon Abraham, still a young man, found himself on trial. He was standing all alone in front of a king, most probably King Nimrod. And even his father was not on his side in this, Abraham's father. And this is in Ur of the Chaldees. But God was on his side, according to the Quran, as he always had been. And so he had this dispute with Nimrod, and while Judeo-Christian traditionalists clearly assert that Abraham was sentenced to the fire by the king Nimrod, The Quran does not elucidate this matter. It does, however, mention that the dispute which a king had with Abraham, and some Muslim scholars suggest that this was the same Nimrod, but only after an attempt was made by the masses to kill Abraham. There was an attempt made by the masses, not necessarily the king himself. And this comes from the Stories of the Prophets by Ibn Kathir. And you can find that out there if you wrote that name down fast enough and can go look him up. And after God had saved Abraham from the fire, this is the fire where they took 4 years to gather enough wood to burn him. I would say that's overkill, but unless, you got Abraham in prison, he gets to look out at the window every day and everybody's like, hey, Abraham, yeah, you see this stack of wood we're bringing in today? We're going to do this for 4 years while you watch us. Yay. You see, 2.5 years in. Hey, Abraham, more wood for your fire. We're going to burn you good. We're going to burn you good. That's it. Makes you know it's his story. And after God had saved Abraham from the fire, his case was presented to King Nimrod, who out of pompousness vied with God himself due to his kingdom. And he debated with the young man Abraham, as God tells us. He says, "Have you not considered him who had an argument with Abraham about his Lord, because God had given him the kingdom?" That's Quran 2:258. And Abraham's logic was undeniable. He answers, "My Lord is he who gives life and causes death." He answered, "I give life and cause death." That's in the Quran, the same passage. And so the king brought 2 men out of the prison that were sentenced to death. And he freed one, and he condemned the other, and killed him. And this reply of the king was out of the context and utterly stupid, if you really look at it. So Abraham put forth another one which would surely silence him. By stupid, I mean this was a stupid example of him showing, I have power over life and death, he's telling Abraham. And Abraham said, "Lo, God causes the sun to rise in the east, so you cause it to come up in the west." Thus was the disbeliever absolutely defeated, and God guides not wrongdoing folks, according to the Quran. So the logic of Abraham, that's like the logic of Solomon when the woman said, "This woman stole my baby," and the woman says, "No, it's my baby," and Solomon says, "I know. Let us cut the baby in 2 and give a half to each of you." And the mother that said, "No, let her keep the baby so he may live." And the other one's like, "Yeah, go ahead, cut it in half." And Solomon, in all his great wisdom, said, we have discovered the true mother, the one that would save his life, not have him cut in half. That's the kind of ancient logic that was being applied here. And so after the years of ceaseless calling, faced with the rejection of his people, God commanded Abraham to disassociate from his family and his people. And he said in the Quran 60, verse 4, "Indeed, there has been an excellent example for you in Abraham and those with him, when they said to their people, 'Verily, we are free from you, and whatever you worship besides God, we have rejected you, and there has started between us and you hostility and hatred forever, until you believe in God alone.'" And at least 2 people in his family did, however, accept his exhortation. And Lot, his nephew, and there's the whole story of Lot and his daughters and his wife, who was turned to a pillar of salt at the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah, that Lot, and his nephew. Lot is his nephew, Abraham's nephew, and Sarah his wife. And so Abraham migrated along with the other believers, most of his family clan. So Lot believed in Abraham. Abraham said, "I will emigrate for the sake of my Lord. Verily, he is the Almighty, the All-Wise." That's Quran 29:26. And so they migrated together to the blessed land, the promised land, the land of Canaan. Or this would be like Greater Syria, where according to Judeo-Christian tradition, Abraham and Lot divided their people west and east of the land that they'd migrated to. Lot went down to the cities of the plain, down near the Dead Sea region, which is Sodom and Gomorrah area. And there were actually 5 cities there, not just the 2 named. And it says in the Quran, "And we rescued him and Lot to the land which we have blessed for the worlds." And it was here in this blessed land that God chose to bless Abraham with progeny and children. We, God, and you see even in the Quran, God refers to himself as we bestowed upon him Isaac and a grandson Jacob, which is Israel. Each one we made righteous. Now, by the way, that's in the Quran. It says that Allah declared Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel, righteous. And that was our proof which we gave Abraham against his people. We raise whom we will in degrees. Certainly your Lord is all-wise, all-knowing. And we bestowed upon him Isaac and Jacob. Each of them we guided, and before him we guided Noah. And among his progeny David, Solomon, Job, Joseph, Moses, and Aaron. Thus do we reward the good doers. And Zechariah and John and Jesus and Elias, each one of them was of the righteous. And Ishmael and Elisha and Jonah and Lot, and each of them we preferred above the worlds of men and jinn. And also some of their fathers and their progeny and their brethren. We chose them, we guided them to a straight path, and this is the guidance of God, with which he guides whomever he will of his slaves. But if they had joined in worship others with God, all that they used to do would have been of no benefit to them. They are those whom we give the book, the understanding, and the prophethood. And that's out of the Quran 6. And prophets were chosen for the guidance of the nation. Now, we didn't find the poem. We got to the story of Abraham, not the poem itself. And maybe we can get to that poem tomorrow. I'm going to find that, and I'm going to look it up, and we're going to read it, because I think it'd be great art and literary topic for us to dig into a little bit. We'll get back to this tomorrow. We're out of time. So thanks for listening. This is interesting stuff to me, and it just goes on and on. There's so much information coming out of just the beginnings of the Tower of Babel story and into Nimrod and now into other things. So we'll see you back here tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your night.